Welcome back. I'm Katie McKinney. Oh, hello. It's nice to have you here too. I'm the founder and the head of school for the Classical Academy de Lafayette. We are a very fast growing private school, kindergarten through 10th grade. Next year we'll go to 11th grade and keep growing until we hit 12th grade. So we are very excited. From last year to this year, we've doubled. So we expect that's going to continue, and very happy to meet lots of people's needs, and happy families are coming, which is great. So before I begin, I wanted to share with you some fun news. Many of you know that we began our first athletic team called the Cal Patriots, and it's a trap shooting team. We had 12 shooters, most of which had never shot a shotgun before, and we had a tremendous year. We started in March of this last year, and we just ended our season a week or so ago. Kids achieving personal bests. Some of them very afraid to pull the trigger, and now they were shooting the end of the season with 25 birds out of 25. It was fabulous. We even had one shooter do 100 out of 100. So it's been really exciting. And in fact, just recently, one of our Cal coaches was with his son, who's now in college, and he was approached by the Lindenwood University trap shooting coach, one of the, if not the I guess, top shooting team in the United States. And the Lindenwood coach came over to our coach and he said, "The growth I've seen in your team this year is unbelievable." He said, "If you guys keep this up, you're going places." So it's been fun. This last June, we had a fabulous fundraiser. It was at Black Hawk Valley, which is a wonderful hunting club up the way. And we thank all of you who were there supporting and participating. We had a great time. We actually have another opportunity this next Friday, November 5th. We're going to have our first annual Cal Patriots Mouse Race fundraiser. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Think of horse racing, but with mice. So it's really fun. And our team has arranged to also have some terrific auction items. We're going to have wine baskets, cardinal tickets, shotgun ammo, Airbnb stays, pistols, and AR-15s, and AR-15 training sessions, not to mention some more gun raffles if you're interested. So we're obviously going to be supporting a great cause. These kids are really going somewhere. They've got fabulous jerseys thanks to the Black Hawk Valley fundraiser. And tickets are $25 a head, which includes all your drinks and a table for, if you want to do a table, you can do a table for 8. Some of you I know are coming, yes, in here? Got a few, okay, great. So if you're interested, we have Amy Wicks and Debbie Moore who are not here, but what I could do at the end is maybe we can put up their contact information if anyone's interested. Okay, so on with tonight. Back in 2010, my husband and I attended a history talk similar to this one. It was focused on our founding fathers and our American roots. And it was kind of a sobering moment for he and myself, because we came to the realization that we had never had this type of history education in our experience. And I had the recollection, I had public school and private school education in my background. And so as I came to understand that, I felt like I had the Roman ruins. I had a little bit of here and a little bit of this, and the picture though wasn't complete. So today, that's kind of what education is looking like today. It doesn't cover the Western tradition. It doesn't cover the ancients, but that was taught decades ago. And it's only been through our own pursuit that we have then begun filling in the details of our own historical education through books clubs, taking Hillsdale courses, attending lectures like the one we're going to have tonight. So our education here is continuing, and I hope for you as well. So our speaker tonight, Mr. Keith Preston, who I am shielding till the curtain is drawn. He's been a consumer of knowledge since his boyhood days. One of his fond childhood memories was his family's acquisition of an Encyclopedia Britannica. Anybody remember those? That's how we used to find information, right? Before we had the internet search engines. Well, he came to appreciate the facts, and his education was then cultivated from his own curiosity. Later, that culminated in a career in the classroom as a teacher, and with the opportunity to then encourage that curiosity and that search for understanding in his own students. His love of our nation and its long-standing emphasis on an educated citizenry is reflected in tonight's presentation. Just last month's topic was kind of a hot topic on the Middle East. Tonight is a hot topic. When we planned these in early June or July, we didn't think it was going to be a hot topic. It's a hot topic. If any of you have been keeping up with the news, there's quite a bit of discussion about education and what is good education. So our talk tonight is entitled A History of Education in the US. John Adams said, "Liberty cannot be preserved without the general knowledge among the people." The founders felt education in a constitutional republic was critical to its success. Our history series tonight is going to examine our nation's promise as codified in the Preamble to the Constitution to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And that's part of our American heritage. So tonight's discussion is going to sketch out the timeline from before independence to today's debates over the role of education in our schools today. So I'm very excited about tonight. So please help me welcome Keith Preston.
Thank you, and for those of you who are here on site, thank you for braving the wicked rainstorm out there. It gets to a point in time when we start reminding ourselves, gee, they wouldn't have complained about this kind of weather in covered wagon days, but we get in our computerized car and go, oh, geez, it's really rainy out here. But I'm glad that you made it, and for those of you who are online and joining us, thank you for being here tonight. So as Katie said, our subject is covering 400 years of education history in our country, and that sounds like a long period of time. It's a lot longer than the period of time that we've been independent. And as she said in her opening remarks, that's exactly true. From the beginning days when the first settlers coming here, education was considered a very important thing. So a couple of things that I want to make sure that we talk about today, and I'm having problems here. So let me see what's going on here. Katie, any idea why? Okay, well, I'm going to do it that way. Okay, so one thing that's important to know is that this is going to be something that we're going to be doing with a broad brush. In other words, I can't get into a lot of specifics. I will mention a few specific institutions, mainly because they're ones that you'll be familiar with. But because of the nature of America, we're going to be painting a broad brush, particularly because for so long, really until the last several decades, education was a local issue or a state issue. It was not in its concept a national issue. It was from the standpoint of what the founders felt the country should have and what Americans felt should be part of our becoming Americans. But the control and the direction and what constituted an education was up to local areas and states to do. So when we talk about this, we'll be talking about certain eras where certain things are going on in the country, but different regions will be reacting to them in different ways. And we still find to some extent that's true today, but the federalization of education in the United States is late in our history and is at the root of a lot of the debates that are going on right now. American education, or education in the United States of America, is something that has attracted people from around the world to come to this country. Think of the number of millions of students come from just about every nation on the planet to come and get an education in an American institution. That is relatively recent. For the most part, it's since World War II. Okay, and we'll talk about a little bit about how that happened and why that developed that way. All right, so let's go all the way back to colonial times. And this is the part I always had fun in my American education, in my American history classes with my students. The fact that we talk about the first permanent settlements in the New World. We talk about Jamestown in 1607. We talk about when the Mayflower came and landed at Plymouth and set up there. And the fact of the matter is, I remind them that the Mayflower is in 1620. So it's very early in American history. We're going to be starting to talk about education. Now, wealthy people didn't worry about local education. They could send their kids back to England for an education. So if I'm George Washington and I'm a planter, if I want to, I can send my kids to Oxford or Cambridge. But the fact of the matter is, once they got there, they were not considered first-class British citizens, even though their parents might be fairly well off and might have a history of several decades in where they are. They were to a great extent considered second-class citizens. It's one of the reasons we had the American Revolution. We didn't feel we were being treated as full citizens of the United Kingdom, full British citizenship. So even if you came from Oxford or Cambridge, they would figure you'd gotten that because of your money, of the influence of your parents back in the colonies, as they would call it. And remember, it's a dangerous journey. You could put your kids on that ship, but there were still a lot of times a storm would come along. We didn't have satellites tracking things or something like that. Ship could go down. Or there were times when there was warfare going on, and you had to do it twice, right? Back to England, and then eventually back to the colonies here. So it's not just as easy as putting them on a plane and send them off to college or something like that. So we decided to create our own educational institutions, and we start very shortly after the Mayflower. 1636 is when John Harvard and his friends established Harvard University. And believe it or not, most of these schools in the beginning were set up in order to train clergy for the early colonies. It was not necessarily to turn out lawyers and doctors and things like that. They wanted to make sure that they had an educated clergy who knew the Bible or who knew whatever the rules were of the Anglican Church at the time. So you got Harvard in 1636. And then you start getting all the other big institutions that are, most of them, in fact, all of them on the name here are still around. William and Mary in 1693. Elihu Yale helped start Yale in 1702. The University of Pennsylvania was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1740. The College of New Jersey, which eventually becomes Princeton University, is set up in 1746. In fact, one of the top administrators of the College of New Jersey was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So most of these schools are for the landed class, people that can afford to send their kids there. And it's part of being a new educated society, the top rank of society in the colonies over here. With the idea that your family's been successful, you now have your own plantation or you have your own business, and you want to make sure that your children are able to maintain and carry on that estate going forward. Most of these colonials that would go to these schools are self-made men. The people that made it back in England had no real interest in braving that Atlantic voyage and going over to the savages in the New World. It's second sons who weren't going to inherit anything. It's people who'd been in the army and looked around and said, holy cow, this land is for free almost. I'm going to stay here. And as time goes on, they became successful, whether it was in trading, whether it was in shipbuilding, whether it was in farming, and then they would start to have their kids go to these schools. When we talk about during the American Revolution, the revolt of taxation without representation, the taxation that was going on at that time was mostly local. We had been used to paying taxes. We like to kind of blithely say, well, the American Revolution was over taxation. It was over whether or not we felt the king had the authority to tax us and not allow the same taxes on British citizens back home. But we have been taxing ourselves since the beginning. That's the main reason you have a legislature. You're going to collect revenue and you're going to spend it on improving the community. We need a road here. We want to build a canal here. We need to set up a city hall here. And many of the taxes in colonial America went to support the ideas of education. People started writing their own primers for different classrooms in the higher elevation, the higher education institutions. And you would also have your own grammar. And after the American Revolution, that's when we start seeing the change in some of the different spellings. Why do they put an extra U in color? Why does humor have a U? And a lot of that was because of the guy you see in the picture here. This is Noah Webster, who is known for putting together the American English Dictionary. And they simplified some of the spellings so that it was the American English version. And that was part of the whole being an identity that was separate from being British. We're not just second-class British citizens who separated. We are our own people. We are Americans. We are different. We have our roots in England. We have our roots in English type of education. But we're going to do things differently because we're going to determine things by merit and not by class, not by blood. Okay? All right. So part of the success of the war for American independence, and I do tell my classes that I separate the two. The war that was fought is the war for American independence. The American Revolution, the true American Revolution, is the Declaration of Independence ideals and the laws of the Constitution of the United States. That's the revolution that is the American Revolution. And it comes as a result of the success of the American War for Independence. So people were debating, what do we do about King George and Parliament and these laws and the tea tax and the stamps and that sort of thing. And why could they do that? Because many Americans could read. And Americans generally could read newspapers, posters, and handbills much more than many other of the world powers in the world, because they would seek out people to teach them how to read. They wanted to know how to read. They wanted to know what was going on. Everything that was going on was affecting them. And the way to be able to figure that out is to have a ability to at least do some rudimentary reading. A lot of it came out of reading the Bible, or listening to things being read, or reading your hymnal, because most people attended church of some sort. And the way it has a part in the playing of the American Revolution is that 150,000 copies of Common Sense were distributed throughout the country. Now think about that. This is a time when you had to put each bill on top of the printing block and roll it through, and then you had to cut them up and find some way to put them together. 150,000 of those. And they went all throughout all the colonies, and people read Common Sense and said, yeah, this makes sense. We should probably have our own country. We kind of have our own people. And the same with the Declaration of Independence. And George Washington, when the Declaration was written, mandated that every officer should get together his group and have the Declaration read to them. So there's enough people in that army that can read that you're going to have somebody there that's going to be able to read to your squad or your patrol or whatever kind of group that you had there. And that's a big part of the support that army went through for those tough 7 years of warfare, to stick with it, because they understood common sense. They heard the Declaration of Independence, and many of them had read it and looked at those words, and they would talk about it and debate it. We like to say Americans don't like to talk about politics. We don't like to fight about politics. But the fact of the matter is, we're all interested in how our local area is doing, how our state is doing, how our country is doing, because we all feel like we have a stake in it. This isn't something that's being decided by somebody else. It's being decided by its citizenry. And that comes from this in our national DNA, an education enough to study and know our own laws, our own rules, our thoughts about ourselves, and what it is we want to accomplish here with this country. Now, we are at this time one of the most literate countries in the world, largely family taught. In many of these areas, in the outlying areas, there's no school, there's no higher education. And what you do get is hopefully somebody in that family, mom, dad, uncle, somebody knows how to read. And a lot of them are reading around the Bible. We love to tell the story about Lincoln reading at night and studying and teaching himself. Now, that's not an unusual happening in that time in our nation's history. It just so happens that very few of them end up becoming president of the United States and leading the country successfully through a civil war. But that is not atypical. The lengths that he went to seek out books everywhere and find a library, like that is unusual. But being able to read was more common than most people think at that time. And then you would get immigrants that would come in. Many of them came over educated. We had two big waves before the Civil War, a wave of Irishmen who came over with the potato famines in the earliest part of the 1800s. And then you had a wave of Germans that came over about 10 to 15, as much as 20 years before the Civil War, who came over because of revolt, a political revolt in Europe. And so they came over to the United States. Those people were educated, and many of them started schools. We've often seen the caricature in a TV show or a movie or a cartoon of the professor speaking with the accents, that sort of thing. But that is actually what you would see happening in the 1830s and the 1840s and the 1850s. Now, many of them were teaching science, they were teaching math, they were teaching astronomy, they were teaching all sorts of, and sometimes they would get into some of the different thoughts of many of the people in the 17th and 18th century and the thinkers. And so you started seeing them individually set up their schools. I grew up a lot of my youth in near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and a lot of that tradition was still going on. We still had schools that had set up certain ways of doing things that they could trace back to the 1840s and the 1850s when it was founded by a number of Germans who had emigrated over to the United States. So you would see these things happening, and a town would really feel that they'd made it when they had their own school. How many of us have seen stories of somebody going, we need to get a school teacher to come to the town and teach the kids and that sort of thing? I remember seeing that in the wagon train movies and things. There's always a school teacher. Sooner or later, it's going to be on that wagon train, and Clint Eastwood was going to fall in love with her or something like that. But she was committed. She was going to teach those kids. And we laugh about it now. But those kinds of ideas are something that were really true. People sought out that. I think, what's her name? Laura Ingalls Wilder was sought out to teach at different places. So this is an American tradition. It really is something, the way that we feel about it. All right. When you talk about the history of education in America, a lot of people go back to Horace Mann. And to some extent, the Horace Mann and some of his methods are debated, but we forget what the time period was when this was going on. We're talking the 1830s and the 1840s. Now, he came out of Massachusetts. At that point in time, if Americans got any kind of schooling, it would be a couple of years, maybe of elementary. I think Lincoln all put together, it's like 1 year and 3 months, bits and pieces here and there. But you would know that one of the things you wanted to do is you wanted to know your letters, you wanted to be able to read words, and you wanted to know basic math, because you were the one responsible for running your shop or for putting money somewhere so that you could buy that house or be able to take care of your children. And so you needed to know basic math, and you were tracking your own business. Mann is the one who started saying we need to come up with a system that we can replicate and then spread it throughout, in this case, Massachusetts. And what happened, people began to hear about it, and they would come from states all over the country to come talk to Horace Mann or witness what was going on in schools and seeing the things we did. So one of the first things he did was have a system of certifying and training teachers. Okay, we want more teachers, yes. How do we make sure that they're getting the right things done, that they're covering the subjects that need to be covered? We're going to have a system of training them. And once we train them, then they will be certified and they can go teach anywhere because they've been trained by the Horace Mann method. And then he started angling, he says, we need more books, and we don't just need books in somebody's house, we need a library. Each school should have a library where books would be. And we need to have textbooks so that we know in 3rd grade they're going to study this in math, in 4th grade they're going to study that. And then we're going to have things separated by subjects. So he's the first one to start having, here's the math class over here. Here's the science class over here. Here's the English class over here. Here's the history class over there. He also brought in bells, so you would move from one room to another. In those days, you rang a handbell. In these days, they're automated. Class periods was something else that he brought in. And the concepts that at the very least, we should get the 3 R's, as we like to call them: reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's always fun because 2 more R's. But anyway, the fact that, and we're not going to count out for spelling on that. And then grades, so that you know where you had stood. And if you go to another town, and these things would happen all the time. Remember, Americans are very mobile. So you leave Ohio and you end up in Missouri. And how do we know how far you've gone? Well, I got through the 3rd year of elementary school back in Ohio, and they would have some idea of what you were prepared to take on. So grades was part of it. And starting to study history and geography. It's a big country, and it kept growing. The last state on the continent gets added in 1912. So there's constantly changing going on to that map all the time. So you need to know where these places are. And that's going to come into play in just a couple of years when you start having armies marching all over the country during the Civil War. Men in Massachusetts that have never been south of New York are suddenly going to find themselves in South Carolina or Georgia. And so knowing your geography, knowing the history of the country, knowing the history of your English heritage and other countries, knowing about Napoleon, knowing about all these different lessons learned from history that apply in many cases to what's going on in the world that they're living in now. And that's their job, to try that together. So people start coming from all over the country and come to see Horace Mann, see the systems that he's using in Massachusetts, and you start seeing more and more of that going around. At this point in time, you had people describing the American public school system as the envy of the world. Now, it's not everywhere yet. It's just beginning. But the country's growing fast too, so it's going to take some time. And as it grows, you're going to see people say, we want to have a school here. We want our kids to be educated. We know they need to read and write, particularly if we're going to be able to run a business, they need to know math. Things are a little different down south. And that's because you have a bit of a different society down there. You never had much public education in the South antebellum, before the Civil War. It would mainly be for military schools, might be where you'd go. And those military schools, most of those officers in the Confederate Army, many of them could trace back their beginning training to the military schools that they went to before the Civil War. Landowners could afford to send their children. In this case, it's almost always going to be boys. There are a few other kind of educated societies down there. Well, they'll have Mrs. So-and-so school for young ladies. Well, they'll be taught, how to be the perfect wife and run the plantation, really, because the women ran the plantations to a great extent in those days. But most of what's going on in the South is just for the wealthiest. Very few people other than the wealthy are getting to school. Now, that's because you didn't require it in that kind of society. You were set. You might be in the military, but most of them are going to run the plantation after dad no longer can run the plantation. Or if dad is gone, it's going to be their plantation. So the wealthy people have got an automatic career ahead of them. So most of what they're going to school for is that the notion that this is what you need to be an educated person, this is what you need to be a higher class of person, and you had a sense of chivalry and nobility, at least in the mind of the Southern culture during that time before the war. After the war, everything changes, because so many of those hopes and dreams went up with the, as they say, gone with the wind. And so afterwards, now you're really going to have to work if you're going to make it down south. You're going to have your own business. You're not going to have any, advancement that other people don't have, because you're inheriting somebody's plantation, because most of those plantations are going to get broken up. So the Civil War is going to change a lot of that. And what they're going to find in order to succeed in an agrarian society, which the South is, it's largely what you grow down there in the South in that time after the Civil War, is you're going to need to be efficient in agriculture. You're going to need to know how to do trade, both with the North and foreign trade, because you still got markets out there in Europe that need what you grow. And finally, language. So if I'm going to be a Southern cotton planter and I'm going to ship my stuff out through New Orleans, I am probably going to want to be able to communicate. If I'm dealing with someone who's French, who's buying it for his mills in France or some other country, you're going to need to be able to communicate with those people. So you'll see people starting to seek schooling down south for those reasons. The freedmen's education was one of the dreams that Abraham Lincoln and the reformers in the wake of the Civil War wanted to see happen during Reconstruction. When they had been in slavery, it was illegal to educate your slave. It was against the law. Why would they do that? It's not racism. It's about, if you educate them, they might get ideas. And then your investment will run off. That's the way they saw it. That was their product. That was their investment. That was their labor machinery. And so you don't educate them. If they can't read a sign, they can't figure out how to escape up north. If they can't read things, they can't read a map. And so it was a way to make sure that your slave did not run off on you. And so one of the first things that the Freedmen Bureau is tasked to do in the wake of the end of the war, and the Freedmen Bureau is set up right near the end of the war, is to help the freed slaves become equal citizens in our republic, is to go to school. And initially, you even had many Northerners who decided that they were going to be a part of this. This was a worthy thing to be involved in. And you had teachers who would come down south and say, I'm going to help set up a school. and get things going there. By the way, if you really want to see some of the things that happened, anybody remember, well, this is a long time ago, the 70s, there was a movie called Conrack with John Voight, and he's a white teacher who decides he's going to come down and try to teach these kids on one of these little plantation islands off the coast of South Carolina. It's really set in an earlier period, but a lot of the same problems that you have for a long period of time in this period of time after the end of the Civil War is going on, where they don't think it's a good idea to have them get educated. It puts ideas in their head, and that's a bad thing, and it makes them, do different things that will cause problems. You're just going to stir up trouble and things like that. And so over time, when Reconstruction ends, and that's a whole nother story, which we'll talk about and when I get into the elections of America, because it's the 1876 election that ends Reconstruction, then the funding goes away. The funding goes away. Most of the northern teachers who came down realized that they're never going to get anywhere with the local population there supporting the education of the freedmen. And so it looks like the whole thing's going to be lost. And then you get heroes like this. Now, I don't know how many of you know who that is. That's Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington is the one who comes up with the idea that every man can pull himself up by his bootstraps if he's given the opportunity. And setting up Tuskegee Institute is the beginning of that. It's his demonstration that will work and that they do want to learn and that it can be successful. And so his name was on a lot of people's lips at the end of the 1800s. In fact, when I talk to my kids about Teddy Roosevelt, and we'll get a little of this on my talk about Teddy Roosevelt, which is our May talk, he got in a lot of trouble because one of the first things he did when he was president is he invited Booker T. Washington to come to the White House. And he wanted to talk about what he as president could do to help his people raise themselves up. And he caught so much heat after that. While he said, I'm not going to let anybody tell me who to sit down and have dinner with, he never did it again. Because he realized that was a politically a spot that he couldn't go if he wanted to continue to be president of the United States. But anyway, Booker T. Washington and a lot of what we call today the HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities, many of them still exist today. And they come about because of this idea that we can't count on anybody else to help us. We're going to have to do this on our own. We're going to set up our own higher education institutions. We're going to set up our own schooling system. We're going to have to find a way to fund that. And if you really want to make it and are willing to work hard, you might get accepted to one of these and you can get an education at a time when education for African Americans was pretty much non-existent, except for some very basic rudimentary Black schools around the South at that time. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that America has done in its past to try to get fully behind education without telling people, this is how you have to do it. And that is by funding things. One of the things that we were very fortunate with this country is that when we became independent, we had this huge amount of land. And within the next 100 years after that, we doubled it. So we've got a huge amount of land out there. And every time we would add land, all of that land, unless it was bought by an individual, was federal government land. There are still huge amounts of federal government land throughout this country. Most of it isn't the kind that anybody would want to necessarily own. And next after them, by the way, I don't know how many people know, the next big owner of land in this country besides the federal government, the railroads. Because we gave them all that money, we granted all that money to them to be able to build the railroads. They got to keep that. And they have huge amounts of land all over the country, most of which is on either side of the railroad. But there's a lot of towns you'll go to and you go, well, who owns this area over there? Oh, that's owned by Santa Fe Southern Pacific. You'll have to go see them if you want to buy that land. So what we decided to do, and this started, believe it or not, during the Civil War. See the date on that? The Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862. It's the same year that the Homestead Act happened. The Homestead Act is, if you sit on this land for a while, you can get so many acres. It's pretty much free. You got to be on it 5 years. Once you've been there 5 years, it's yours and you can sell it. Okay, that's the Homestead Act. The Morrill Land Grant Act kind of does the same thing, but for educational institutions. They had a number of them. Well, the first one was 1862. The last one was in 1890. And basically, they were for agriculture and machinery studies. We're now in a time period where they see that machines are going to be the future. And that if you're going to be successful as an agriculture man, you just can't do what they used to do, where you'd farm a plain or a field or something like that until it ran out, and then you just go clear another one and you do the same thing all over again. Now you're going to want to make that land work for a long period of time. So we've got to figure out what we need to do in order to make that land more fertile, take care of it, keep the pests away where you can, and try to maintain that soil. I know the question in some people's minds, so how did the Dust Bowl happen? We'll get to that. Well, basically, they ignored a lot of rules. Well, those are people that didn't have the money to go to one of the A&M schools. And of course, that's what they're called, A&Ms. So when you see Texas A&M, Oklahoma A&M, all these different A&M schools, and kids say, what does A&M stand for anyway? Agriculture and machinery. They were moral land grant schools. So these free federal land grants shows again that the focus of the country and the knowledge of the people who were setting things up was, this is what we need to do in order to make the country continue to do well. The really great land is east of the Mississippi. You got that southwestern land. Nobody's going to try to grow cotton in New Mexico. Nobody's going to try to grow lettuce in Arizona. So you're going to have to be really efficient with the areas that you have. So this breadbasket we have in the center of the country, what's known as the Great Plains, Nebraska, Kansas, etc. We're going to have to make sure that we do a really good job of taking care of that. And so Civil War veterans, young men of the 1870s, 1880s, you wanted to be a really good farmer, not just a local farm, but you really wanted to make it as a farmer. If you could, that was very reasonably priced. The state encouraged people to go there. They would help pay for it in some states. And you could go the 4-year college there, and out of that, you would really know modern agriculture. Or if you said the future is going to be machinery, somebody's going to have to fix those machines. When we get Mr. Carnegie starting to make his steel mills, and we get Mr. Rockefeller starting to make all his refineries, somebody's got to keep that machinery working. You want to be one of the people that has a future doing that, you're going to go to an A&M school and learn how to do the machinery. So these Civil War veterans come out of there and they start going to some of these different schools, learn how to be a more efficient farmer, learn how to be a mechanic, learn how to invent new machinery, which is going to be constantly happening during that time. So new techniques and the advances of both agriculture and agriculture machinery. My wife and I have a place out in Newtown, and we love sitting there and watching the machinery go by and the guys with all the different harvesters and hoppers and things like that. And it's just amazing to us to watch that go down, and we know where it started and where we've gotten to this present day. So that was the 19th century version of big tech, International Harvester and McCormick's Harvester and all those different buildings. Now, this is what we think of when we think of early America school, the single room schoolhouse. And yeah, there are a few left these days, mainly, this is what it used to look like. Come to the national park and see what a single room schoolhouse had. However, by this point in time, you're starting to get religious groups deciding that they want to have schooling too. They want to have their own schools. Some states passed laws banning public funds for parochial schools. And that was understandable. That would be explained as being a violation of what would later be known as the Establishment Clause, that Congress shall make no establishment of a religious institution. And so people saw it that way. But there was a period of time where you had a number of what were called Blaine laws. Blaine was a man, actually ran for president at one point in time. I think he was from Maine, I'm not sure. But anyway, he was very anti-Catholic at that time. And he ran for president saying, I'm running against Romanism and rebellion, which was a thinly veiled version of saying he was critical of Irish. But he tried to pass a law saying that you had to go to a public school or an approved private school. You could not go to a parochial school. And so states said, yeah, those parochial schools also must pass the same accrediting standards that a public school would have. And it was typical in those days to have 12 years of school expected. That's when that starts happening before you go on to college. So in some way or another, you had to be able to demonstrate you had enough schooling that would equal 12 grades of school. Most states have some sort of free schooling during this period of time, usually, again, by merit. You apply, you take a test, you get accepted. The school is getting funded by the state anyway, and you can get free schooling. Yeah.
Confirm though that high school, as we understand it today, was more of a college prep.
That was exactly. It was very definitely 9 through 12 would be considered college prep.
Okay.
Absolutely, absolutely. But if you wanted to get into that college, you had to be able to show you had the prep, and that's what a high school would do. Now, the idea by the time we get to the late 1800s is that we want to get to a country where we've got 100% of some kind of schooling, at least certain kind of schooling. And in order to set that area, as we started attacking the child labor laws in the late 1800s into the 1900s, you started inventing ways to keep people going to school even when they kind of needed to go work to help the family, and that is the truancy laws. I don't know if anybody even remembers that phrase, truancy. I say that to the kids and they look at me with a strange look. But in those days, if you didn't keep going to school at least to a certain age, they might be 12 in some states, 14 is what I remember it was when I was growing up, then you would be declared truant, and the state had the right to come ask your parents, say, why isn't your child in school? So the country wants to have 100% schooling. So eventually you are going to see public education in all states. Private education, for the most part at this time, is still the realm of the wealthy and the realm of those who want to say, well, I sent my kid to XYZ school, and that's a prestigious thing, and hopefully will help them along in life. And as I said, truancy is against the law. Now, Oregon, during this time, and we're talking the early 1900s, about 1921, I think, 22, tried to have a law that would force everyone to go to public schools only, which would, of course, have been the death knell for most private schools unless they could find a way to be a cross between the two. So this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the case is Pierce versus the Society of Sisters in 1925, a 9-0 win for the Society of Sisters. And here's the pull-away quote from the decision: "A child is not a mere creature of the state." And that's part of the battle we're fighting right now, guys, because in most other countries, they are considered that way. Anywhere where you have a socialized education, you're going to have the state saying, well, since we're going to be paying for your son's college or trade school or whatever we determine that child should have, then we can decide where he goes. And we can decide what path he's going to be on. And we can decide whether that school meets that standard or not. And so they really do, in many of these, even the Western European countries, consider children to be kind of wards of the state. And that's kind of some of what we're fighting here right now in this country. I'll get more into that a little bit later. Anyway, I think it's a very important case. And I love that quote: "A child is not a mere possession of the state." All right. So I moved it back. Pardon me here while I move back. That's such an important quote. "A child is not a mere creature of the state." All right. The next game changer in our story is the GI Bill, which is actually passed in 1944. And when it becomes clear, it's only a matter of time and the war is going to be over. And it's very simple what the GI Bill was about. There was a tremendous fear, completely understandable, maybe not justified, but certainly understandable, that when the war ends, the Depression will return. And the reason is because at that point in time, you had over 10 million men who were employed in the United States military, who were soon going to be mustered out, because our history has always been that we do not have a permanent military. So as soon as World War II is over, most of those men are going to leave the military, and will there be jobs for them back home? What do we do in the meantime? They can't all hit the job market all at the same time. And of course, a lot of the people who are going to have to be expected to leave their jobs is going to be who? Who's going to be expected to leave those jobs that they were doing during World War II? Women. Yeah, the kids don't understand this, so I'll have to explain this to them. It was new for women to be in the war. Well, that's not true. World War I, you had a lot, but really in World War II, a tremendous, Rosita Riveter.
Pensioner protests outside of the White House after World War I.
Yes, yeah, and then they had the bonus bill in 1932, the bonus bill, right? That's something I'd love to have a talk about that sometime, but we got to move on.
Soldiers are dangerous to leave lying around.
That's always a problem.
Yeah.
And they do tend to march really well, and they can go a long distance. So the game changer is the GI Bill. I'm so, my dad, Marine Corps, 51, 52. So how do we prevent a return of the Depression after World War II? So the GI Bill, amongst other things, said, number one, if there's a new job open or there's a job opening, preferential treatments should be given to veterans. People had no problem with that. They had made the sacrifice. They deserved first in line. Number two, a free education. And you started seeing in colleges and universities around the country a slew of 20-something freshmen, which was a different group, who had seen things that the 18-year-old freshmen certainly had not seen, and had wisdom that they could communicate to. And I remember my dad telling me about some of the places that he knew of that had freshmen who had gone into college right out of World War II, and how unusual it was. Those guys worked hard, because they really appreciated what they had. And a college degree, as we've all known most of our lives, was part of the ticket to success. And certainly, if you were a veteran of World War II and you came back, what was going to distinguish you from all the other candidates? Because, before World War II was a long depression. And how do you get chosen over all the other people who want that same position? So you could say, well, I'm a veteran. Yeah, I got 6 of those back here. And I've just finished, with a 2-year junior college degree or a 4-year degree or engineering or whatever it happens to be. So the GI Bill is a big, important part of that. It also pushes a lot of money into the colleges and universities, who go out and start building new buildings, building more dormitories, building a science hall, because science is the big thing that comes out of World War II. Ammo. It's the atomic era now, and a lot of new things are opening up. We're shooting rockets into places, and we've got a supersonic military, and we do have a more permanent military come out of that war. So educated people is one of the things you need to come out of war, and they're going to want it for their children. So most of us sitting here who are of my era and have the kind of hair I have, our parents wanted to make sure that we got a college education so that we would be able to compete with all the other people in our baby boom generation. And it's called a boom because there's a lot of us, and many of us remember, okay, I've tried these 3 or 4 places. Nobody needs anybody to work. I've got to find some sort of job, so I need to make money. You might need to make money so that you can go spend another year at school. Okay, so they're going to want it for their children as well. As time goes on, we're talking the 60s, we're talking the 70s, a lot of things changed. As we know, the 50s and 60s were a time of a lot of discrimination, whether it was racial discrimination or gender discrimination, but there's or national heritage. That's going to start changing. Now, in the South, in the beginning, it was kicking and screaming. And now I watch Ole Miss play Alabama, and I kind of chuckle. But that's okay. The fact of the matter is, over time, it's going to change because the country is changing and the dynamics are changing. And so in the 1970s, you start getting, it's kind of an accepted thing. I'm a senior in high school. So where are you applying to college? I don't know. Where are you applying to college? And for athletes, there's an opportunity to go there and play sports. And now TV's throwing a ton of money at these schools too. I remember, I don't know how long ago. Remember when Notre Dame got like a 10-year deal with NBC as exclusive? So you knew they were going to be on TV every weekend playing somebody. That's a tremendous amount of money that got thrown in. I'm not begrudging them that. I'm just saying that money changed a lot of things. And then not too long after that, people said, well, that's great. What are we going to do with the money? We're going to hire more professors. We're going to teach more classes. Oh, there's a demand to teach this or to take this class instead of, studying Latin or studying Greek or studying a mythology. I want to learn Native American literature. Okay, well, I've got to find somebody who can teach that class. And then Title IX, which happens late in this period, says you need to spend an equal amount of money where you can on women's programs. And so next thing you know, you've got women's lacrosse and you've got women's soccer, and again, that's great. You're going to need money to do that. So again, you start looking at what are some ways that we can monetize some of this money. Well, we can have more and more television exposure. Remember, ESPN, which is the big broadcaster, stands for Entertainment and Sports Programming Network. And one of the things they were constantly looking for in the early days was, what can we show? I remember seeing a lot of things I had never heard of before because there wasn't enough football or other games going on. But as time goes on, now you're going to start seeing women's basketball. Now you're going to start seeing lacrosse, which I had never seen until I came out here to the Midwest in St. Louis. And even private schools are going to say, we need more students in order to have the tuition money that needs to come in and support this infrastructure. So a lot of boys' schools went co-ed, a lot of girls' schools went co-ed, and there's another way to advance the funding of these things that need to happen. Now, the Great Society programs in the 60s is what began to bring massive amounts of money to the states for educational systems, and understandably also with certain stipulations. Yes, we're going to give this money for your educational institution, but you have to make sure that you're not discriminatory on race, or you're not discriminatory on gender, or you're not discriminatory on what kind of things we want to see what you're going to do with the money. And there's a term for that we're going to get to in a little bit. As time goes on, you're going to see, oh, thank you very much. I found that somewhere, and I said, well, what slide can I use that on? First calling off the assembly using Common Core. The laboratory of progressivism, which was always at the forefront in universities, really kicks into gear in the 80s and the 90s. And then you start seeing, yes, we're going to give away free meals to certain groups. We're going to have to be a little more lower on the standards because we've got this certain group that's being kept out and we want to have more of them at our school. And then the first time I started hearing the term social justice was right after the 2000s started happening. And the massive amount of student debt, which is funded by government programs saying, we want everyone to have a chance to go to school. That's great. But then they're going to have this debt they're going to have to pay off. And that's really accelerated over the last 10 to 15 years. And it's one of the reasons you got some of the things going on in education right now is because they have so much money. I think someone correct me if I'm wrong here. I think I'm in the ballpark that Harvard has an endowment of $60 billion.
Something like they could not charge tuition again ever. And still operate like they do now for another 100 years.
But that's not going to happen. Trust me, that's not going to happen. And of course, they don't have to pay taxes on that. So the fact of the matter is, it becomes big business. And so in order to support that, all the people that you've hired, the administrators you've hired, much more than teachers, administrators, you've got to have some sort of standards. And the federal government decides that they want to make these standards more common. We want to make sure somebody gets a 12th grade degree graduating from high school in New York. It means pretty much the same thing as somebody graduating in Arizona. And so that's what the idea of Common Core was originally about. But as time went on, it was inflexible to the different needs of the different states. That's one of the reasons that education has always been decided at the state level, because each state needs something differently. The fact of the matter is, somebody in Arizona may not necessarily know how to live in an apartment in a downtown area. And somebody in New York City is not necessarily going to want to know how to rotate your crops in your field. And so you've got the states have always had the right to fit things to what works for their state. But over time, more and more of the federal government's creeping in. One of the great ways to get elected or reelected is say, I'm for spending more money on schools, because they know there's a ton of parents out there who say, yes, I like this guy. He wants to spend more money in schools. I'm going to vote for it. Most of that money goes through administration or building buildings, not necessarily hiring better teachers or training better teachers, or checking out and seeing what the curriculum looks like. Is it meeting the needs of the students? We call this Fiscal federalism. The federal government does not have the right to tell the states what they have to teach. However, they can tie their federal education aid to you meeting certain requirements in order to get that aid. And what has happened over time is most states have become hooked on needing that federal money to go into their state educational system to make the school system continue to operate. And so in the end, although the federal government can't make them do it, they know they're not going to get the federal money if they don't. And so that fiscal federalism is what is really driving a lot of the changes that we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years in our educational system, because that's what people have to do in order to qualify for that federal money. Technology in the classroom is something relatively recent in some areas. I've seen a lot of the impact of it the last 15 to 20 years. It's like any other tool. It's only as good as what you're using it for. If somebody puts a plow in my backyard, I'm not going to know very much to do with it. And besides, I don't want to plant anything. And it's the same thing with a computer. Well, we've got computers now. Yes, but what are you doing with it? Are you doing something that's helping the kids learn something better than they could without that computer? Or is this a chance for them to watch YouTube videos while you're up there teaching the class? And I've lived both of those, okay? So it can be a blessing or a curse, and doesn't automatically make the students ready for the world. Oh yeah, they're gonna have all these IT skills. They're gonna be ready for the world. No, they're not. They're gonna be ready maybe to continue sitting in the basement doing this at 25, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're gonna be able to go out and be an educated person in the world. It depends on what you use it for. Yes, and this is really where having an idea of what it is if you know what you want to achieve, it's easier to do it. And right now, we've got parents who think one thing's going on in the classroom and another thing's actually going on in the classroom. And that's one of the few blessings of COVID, is that parents begin to realize what's actually going on in the classroom, or better yet, what's actually not going on in the classroom. And that's good, because we just assume that, hey, they're teachers, they know what they're doing. You know, I know what my experience was like in school. Your experience in school is very different from what most kids are getting in school these days. So you got, with technology, you got distraction. They can be in their own silos, okay? Go just whatever my interests are, and I don't expand my horizon at all. I reinforce my own bias. Academic workers think, well, yeah, that's okay. We got good things going on. And this is where I put the alligator. And the problem is, if you don't see the problem, you think, well, the alligator will eat me last. He'll eat everybody else first. And that's not a solution to our problem. Students need knowledge, not having to be taught the right opinions. And I try to do that in my class. Some of you, I recognize a few faces, and I've had their children in my class. And one of the things that I was most happy about is when someone would come up to me and say, my student doesn't know where you stand on this political issue, or where you're in this political, and good, that makes me happy. I'm there to teach them knowledge. Their opinions will come from their understanding, interpretation, and experience of that knowledge. And that's what we need to see more of. And if I may, we'll plug here, that's what we focus on here at the Classical Academy de Lafayette. We are about knowledge, not right opinions. So I put this together, having a little fun with it. The Wilkpire Strikes Back. This is something we're seeing over the last couple of years. I'm going to kind of wade a little bit into opinion here. Critical race theory. I'll just say, from my perception, if it's about race, it's racist. That is the definition of it. And I don't think you cure racism with other racism. But I think we're going to have to figure this out as a country. Teachers are taught critical race theory in ed school, whether they call it that or not. And I understand the motivation. And what I don't understand is being taught that in many classes that we're seeing these days, particularly what we call sociology classes or the social studies, which is not the social studies I had when I was growing up, is that the United States is the source of most, if not all, of the problems in the world. We are actually the solution to it. We just fight it out in the open, and we discuss it and we debate it. And that, I think we're continuing to do that right now. The idea that capitalism is bad and socialism is good. It hasn't worked anywhere. It is what's made this country the greatest country. And we try to do indoctrination, not education in some of these schools. And that's wrong. It shouldn't be about the way you think about certain things when you leave. Finally, parents are starting to take on school boards because they're becoming aware of what's going on in these schools. And that is the way the system is supposed to work. They are supposed to be answerable to the taxpayers and the parents of the children. That's why you all are here. That's why we have students that we have here at Cal, and why we've had such a boom lately, because they're looking for a school that listens to the parents. And at the same time, they know that we're going to act in the best interest of their children acquiring knowledge here, and not whether or not they acquire certain opinions. I remember years ago, John Stennis was a senator from, I can't remember, it was Alabama, Mississippi, one of those places down south. Yeah. Anyway, he was on the first Ken Burns film was about Congress, and he was talking about how he'd had an argument at one point in time with a British guy. And he says, well, you know, King George, he says, in America, the people are the king, he said. And in essence, that's the way it's supposed to be. Obviously, we've had 330 million kings, so we all can't be kings. But in the end, we're the ones that determine what our government does. We just have to let them know. And we get to do that every once in a while. Things called elections. So we lend the power of the people to these elected reps, and part of that is what goes on in our schools. And I'll just end with this controversy, which many of you probably have been aware of over the last number of days, where the former governor and now running for governor again in Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, said, and I quote, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach." Okay? Now, I'm sure he didn't mean it to come out like it was said. But the fact of the matter is, we are having that debate. Who determines what it is that our students, our children should be taught? And that's just, we all are very busy. We have jobs, we have families, we have crises. But in the end, the future of the country is an educated citizenry, which started doing that back in the early 1600s. And while you have other countries that consider their children to be owned by the state, I'm hoping that's not the direction America is going. And even if they are, then remember who's paying the bill. And that's you sitting in this room, and I will be happy to entertain a few very short questions. Yes.
Yeah, I saw on Fox News that Youngkin was 5 points behind McAuliffe, and then they were tied. And the latest, just this afternoon, Youngkin is like 6 or 8 points ahead. So this educational issue in Virginia is driving the polls.
Right. And I think you're at a point in time here, you've had kind of a perfect storm of COVID, lockdowns, how long the mask mandates have gone down, the attitudes of the teachers' unions, and again, I'm not, everybody has their own opinion on that. I'm just saying all those things are part of the mix, and you add in this sort of thing, which again, this is an attitude. I know family members who lived in Europe, and this is the way their governments think of the children. They are part of the state is responsible for those children, and they have the right to override the parents. I don't think we're like this in this country, but I think we're going to find out over the next couple of elections whether we are this way in this country. But that is not our history. Yeah.
So I was recently talking to a parent who is questioning whether college is necessary.
Yeah.
Because of what's happening in, or it has happened in our universities.
Yeah.
Knowing the trajectory of the history that you've shared with us tonight.
Yeah.
If you could project 20, 30 years out,
Yeah.
where do you see universities and colleges, where's their place if they have one?
I agree. I think the unbelievable amounts of debt that some of these students are racking up, I think what they're hoping, and politically it may happen, is that the government will just wipe it out. And, you know, we're talking about $1.5 trillion, but it's a number that doesn't seem to faze people like it used to, I guess. But the fact of the matter is that what are they getting for their money? And what do you, I mean, I know when I went to college, I was a history major because I loved history, but I didn't really think I was going to teach it. But I, you know, obviously I did at some point in time, but I started my real love career at 48. So for a number of years, I did other things. But what I knew it did teach me, because my father was a history major, but my father also was a major executive at Johnson Wax and Gillette and Campbell Soup and a couple of places, and obviously it did well enough. Of course, it was Princeton. But the fact of the matter is that it did teach me how to think. It did teach me how to write. It did teach me how to speak in public. It constantly challenged my preconceived ideas and what I thought was right. And it made me rethink my own opinions. And that's what a good education should do. I do think you'll probably see my son got a computer science degree, and he's always made more money than me since he got his first job in the computer in IT world. And I think you're going to see a lot of people going that. But what's the old joke they've been saying? Learn to code or whatever it is. But he doesn't write code. He's a systems administrator, which is kind of like a mechanic for technology. But I think you're going to find that people are saying, here are the things that I want out of my life. And if you listen to Mike Rowe talk on dirty jobs, everybody know who Mike Rowe is? Yeah, okay. He says, if you want to be a welder today, you can make $160,000 a year. Why would you not want to do that instead of, be in a cubicle somewhere and be paying off $60,000 worth of college debt for, I don't know, I'm not going to say something because I'll offend somebody with whatever I use as my example, but you know what I'm talking about. So I do think you're going to start to see 2-year schools being more of a way to go. Trade schools, depending on what the trade is. And again, whatever the 21st century version of A&M, it's not all going to be Denken and DeVries and all these other things. You've got to have something deeper than that, so that what they go into the world, there's something better than what the other candidates have when you're looking for this position. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see colleges do. I think they got a challenge before them, and I don't think they see it coming right now. And that's a wake-up call. Yes, my wife.
Oh, yes. When I was living in Holland, when my children were small, it was kind of a wake-up call to me. We had, we had a Swedish family in the school that that my kids were attending. And they had fled Sweden because this was in 1995. So they had fled Sweden because their children, they learned when they wanted to send their children to a Montessori school, they learned that their children were not theirs. Children were owned by the state. They had no idea of that. And so they were not allowed to do that. So they basically just escaped. They came to the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, I found that my children, at that time, my son was in the 6th grade, and in the next year, he was going to have to take a test, and that test would determine, the state would determine whether he went to college or he went to another kind of school. And as a parent, as an American parent, one always thinks that one wants to be the one who makes those decisions. So that's why I believe there's such alarm right now over the state or the federal government's hand in education.
Yeah, for those who couldn't probably hear the question on the internet, it was based on my wife talking about her experiences when she was over in the Netherlands for a while, and the Swedish couple that had come to town, and they had come there because Sweden considered their children to be wards of the state, basically under control of the state. And in the Netherlands, because they're going to pay for it, that they can determine by their testing as well. He was, 12 at the time?
12.
Yeah, they were going to determine which path he was going to go on, towards trade school or towards college. And you know what happens to a lot of those European kids that end up being told they're going to the trade school route? They go to college in the United States, where we still have a choice. So that's kind of what things are doing here. Somebody else had a question.
Yeah, I was going to follow up. I think universities, I sit on a number of advisory boards to universities. They have been addressing the problem of their relevance for the last decade at least. Their weakness was tenureship, especially on the science sides, because once you're tenured, you might have written the book 40 years ago, but it's not relevant today. And trade schools are much more relevant and cheaper and so on and so forth. So they are struggling with their relevance.
Yeah.
And the best schools in terms of science actually don't offer tenureship to their professors. And I think it's very good. It's parallel between that and Germany. In Germany, you can't teach unless you've practiced.
Right.
And I think that's perhaps the way to go, but they can't solve the problem because they are part of the solution.
Right.
They are part
Right.
of the problem
Right.
and can't solve it.
The commentary here by one of our attendees here is that tenure is a big problem. It tends to, you be able to sit on an old triumph that you had many years ago, and it doesn't challenge you to continue to remain relevant. The schools that are most successful are two-year schools or trade schools where they don't have tenure and they have to compete for those positions. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. Again, one of the reasons I get concerned about something like, Harvard having $60 billion, if you got $60 billion, all right, let's just say you have a large endowment, you're not really being pushed to be competitive. There's not somebody else going to take that money away from that school. And so, that you can continue to fund things down to people's retirement. What may happen, I think what you're going to start to see is some of the smaller schools are going to fail. They're just not going to be able to keep up. And I don't know where that's going to get us, because unfortunately, some of the smaller schools will be the ones who would be best enabled to be able to compete and try new and more current appropriate subjects and majors and such. Yes.
Yeah, I don't have a question, it's more of an observation based on my own experiences. When I went to college, dormitory was very spartan. It was like a mattress and no springs and a tiny little desk and a tiny little closet and some drawers. That was it. And it was a shared bathroom. And so my brother has his daughter's at KU, not picking up KU.
Well, I'm sure you could repeat it everywhere,
But he showed me, he kind of, well, first he got on the internet and, got in and he was walking me through the dormitories and the facilities. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, and we had just got back from Marco Island, which is really nice down in Florida, Marriott Hotel. And I'm thinking, this is like a 4-year luxury vacation with these facilities that these kids have now. And to me, that's a big part of why it's so expensive now.
And unfortunately for them, one of the reasons they're having to do that is they want to make sure they go to KU and not KSU or Wichita State or some other place that they're competing with.
Yes.
It's like looking at Costco travel and see all the cruises you can go to. They're competing for you to come to go on their cruise.
You're right about that.
Yeah.
There's a competition.
Yeah, I don't know what's going to change that right now.
I don't know how you fix it.
Well, one of the things that I always think about it, and it applies to just about everything. I don't remember which congressman or senator sent that. Said anything you want more of, subsidize. Anything you want less of, tax it. And at some point in time, we're going to have to figure out what part of our education system is
I
working,
just wonder.
and subsidize that, and tax or at least stop subsidizing that.
Well,
Which
that's
is
kind of what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Is I don't know if you could turn the brakes off completely, but I
right.
do wonder what would happen with tuition if the government quit guaranteeing everybody as much money as, I want $100,000 this year to go to my school. Oh, okay.
And because so many of those kids
No,
are
I'm
going
gonna
on that
major
federal
in
money.
Something that's gonna, pay $25,000.
The tuition
The
goes
math
up 2 or
doesn't
3
make
times
any
inflation, and there's no pain.
And if you're gonna be a doctor, well, that's different.
Right.
You can pay back that loan.
Right. Yeah, okay, yeah, but anybody else wants to chat with me, I'll hang around for a little bit, but I gotta get out of here pretty quick now. But I appreciate so much your attention, and I hope to see you all next month, and we'll talk about the history of the American family. That should be really fun.
those up here. So we've been learning tonight about education, and for me, the importance of it is that we're governed by reason and conscience. That's what we're doing here. Our founders understood that an education includes proper training in mathematics, reading, writing, and it prepares us to be self-governed. And to me, there's two benefits to that, especially here in this country. Obviously, being governed, self-governed means you're prepared to assist in the maintenance and the prosperity of a free society. That's number one. Number two, being self-governed means we can then govern the government and not be subject to the government, but be the government ourselves. You can't do that though, unless you are governed by reason and conscience. And so I think that's why a classical education, I believe, is so important. We need the next generation to know what's required of them and for them to be ready to take their part in this republic. We want them to accomplish what it means to flourish as a human being, to think, to reason, to know. And here at Cal, we're living this privilege every single day where we get to assist our students. And I hope you feel that way tonight. That's why you're here, to learn something new, for you to grow and for you to maximize who you are. I hope in the last 60 or I guess 75 minutes that you feel more enlightened than you did before you walked in here. And that's what we're doing for our kids every single day. So thank you again, Mr. Preston. It was wonderful. And thanks for all of you coming and for all of you online. God bless and good night. Thank you.